Hello everyone, welcome. Hi. Hi guys. How's it going? We're here. We are sharing the world. We're gonna share this on frickin' Twitter and be like, yo dogs, you wanna watch this fool paint? Something dumb? I don't know. Okay, here we go. Let's do this. Boom, 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 boom. Man, I don't want you to see my face. I feel very whatever. Okay,
Like sort of rebellion.
we're gonna
I
listen
wrote
to
Fight Club
Chuck
because I knew they wouldn't buy that. I knew that if I did it well enough, they would never forget it. And at that point, it was more about revenge than it was about actually selling anything.
Okay.
So Chuck, tell me about your childhood. You grew up where?
I grew up in eastern Washington State on the Snake River, which is a tributary of the Columbia River in this huge, vast, sort of arid desert part of the state.
Tell me about your family.
My family, all the kind of Dust Bowl people who kind of came into that area during the Depression, and they came in really by the work provided by the Hanford nuclear reactor. They came from Montana, they came from North Dakota, and because of the housing shortage, they all ended up settling in this one small town. So at one point we had generations and generations of my father's family and my mother's family in this town called Burbank, Washington. It was probably the most
We're gonna use
happy,
this.
glorious time of my life. You know, where
When I
you're
see
related to
you,
half the
we
people
will
in the
say
town.
something to you. Otherwise, I'm listening to this
Yeah,
guy.
I wish I had made more of it. I wish I had talked to them more about what had brought them there.
Your relationship with your parents was good?
It was good. You know, it was good, but boy. And I'm sorry, I'm one of these people that stops a lot and thinks a lot. And that's really difficult for a lot of people to be with. I'm not going to be a kind of wall-to-wall carpet of talk.
Mm-hmm. That's fine. I know your father had an interesting story.
My father, when he was about 3 years old, his father had come back from working in the shipyards in Seattle during World War II. And the family story is that he had taken a block and tackle to the head. He'd come back a different person. And at one point, he had flown into a rage, accusing my grandmother of adultery. And at the time, most of the kids were at school. And my father was at home, and I believe there was another sibling at home. My father was about 3. And there was a gunshot. And my father went around this farmhouse up in the Idaho mountains looking for his mother. And he couldn't find his mother, and he had to hide underneath his bed. And his father was walking around the house carrying a shotgun, calling for my father. In effect, trying to find my father to kill him also. That
So your grandfather suspected his wife of
adultery. And he subsequently shot the other child who was home, walked around the house trying to find my father to shoot him, and then ultimately shot himself. So it was a murder-suicide, and then growing up we were always told that they had died of diphtheria. And then around the age of 21, I was home for Christmas, and my mother said, oh, by the way, it wasn't diphtheria. And she told me the story about
Okay, I do love this brush. It's just a little
and I said, so
the
what
sable
did
is
where
kind
were
of
they shot?
weird
Where were
to
they killed?
use,
And
but I do like it.
and she got this funny, sad look, and she said, do you remember that yellow bedroom that was off the kitchen? That yellow bedroom with no windows? And I said, yeah, that was the bedroom we kids had to sleep in every summer when we went to visit. And she said, I felt so bad turning off the light and leaving you 4 kids to sleep in that room every night. And it was the creepiest room. It had no windows, it had just a door into the kitchen, and it had a rollaway bed, and it was that bed under which my father had hid to save his life, and it was on that bed that my grandmother had been killed. And then to realize that for all those summers we'd also slept on that bed, it was just it was a relief to hear the truth, but it was also kind of an ick moment to find out that, you know, very little of that house had changed. And because there was no one to head the household, his older brother had to be called home. And his older brother had gotten married, moved to Seattle, and had created his own life. And I believe there was 16 siblings altogether. And the older brother, my Uncle Pete, was so angry about this that he was fantastically abusive, and he would just beat the younger kids because he was a young man. He was probably 19 or 20, and suddenly he was in charge of this whole brood of kids in this house in the middle of nowhere. And he beat my father so badly that at one point my father decided that he was going to leave home. He was going to just set out. And my father was, I think, about 8 or 9 at that point. So he ran away from home. And at one point, he had been picked up by a farmer who said, come out to my farm in Moxie, Moxie is nothing, it's a rail stop in the middle of nowhere. And you can work on my farm and I'll give you a place to stay. And something happened that very first night that my father was at this farm in Moxie. And it's something that my father would never talk about. But he ended up running away from that farm in the middle of the night, and he was arrested for vagrancy and put in jail in Walla Walla. And he did talk about that. He did talk about the worst part of his life was being in jail as an 8 or 9-year-old kid in Walla Walla, and how he could see a clock tower through his cell window. And eventually, one of his married sisters, my Aunt Mary, showed up and took custody of him, and he was raised the rest of his growing up with her. So that's my father's growing up.
And he must have been heavily affected by that, losing his mother at such a young age. He ended up having this enormous life of pursuing women. He was good looking, and he was very robust. In his high school annual pictures, he looks like a grown man. He's so muscular, and his muscles are so defined that he looks more like the coach than he does like a player on any of the teams. And he was also very dark-skinned. As a kind of first-generation Ukrainian peasant, he was very, very dark, and people always thought that my parents were a mixed race. My father looked much more like a African American and much more like a Hispanic than like a European. But Dad was just always very attractive and very charismatic, and he could talk to anyone. And he also had this kind of gift for the grand gesture.
I like this. I like what's going on. Am I in your? I'm kind of in your way, huh?
He decided that he was going to.
Let's move it over here.
And I'm going to backtrack right here. Years ago, when I was in college,
It's a little bit better.
some friends and I went to Vancouver, British Columbia, to sell ecstasy in the bars. We smuggled all this ecstasy into Canada, and we were going to go out to nightclubs and just sell it, pay for our whole trip, make a bunch of money, go back to the University of Oregon, where we were students. And so one night, we had taken ecstasy, we'd sold all of our stock, we were all laying around the floor of the Nelson Place Hotel on Granville Street, this flop house hotel. And nobody could sleep, so people were saying, what's your strangest memory? And my best friend, a guy named Franz, who is now an architect, he said that when he was a kid growing up in Butte, Montana, his parents had sent him to stay with friends of theirs hundreds of miles away. And the friends had a florist shop, and he was supposed to work there all summer and earn money. And at one point, these people at the florist shop, they woke him up way before dawn, like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And they had him load enormous amounts of flowers, wreaths and garlands and all these flowers into vans. And they drove these vans across the desert for hour after hour in the middle of nowhere. And they waited next to a railroad siding. And finally, around just before dawn, a train came over the horizon, and it pulled into this railway siding. It was the Amtrak Empire Builder, headed from Portland to Whitefish, Montana. And Franz and everyone had to decorate this entire train with all these flowers. And they had to build a little scaffolding on top of the engine. And people were waking up in the train and they were cursing Franz for why is the train stopped? Why are you decorating this train with flowers? And eventually Franz said, a car full of people got out and arrived, including a bagpipe player. And these people climbed up on top of the engine, and the bagpipe player played as the sun was coming up in the desert, and it was incredibly freezing cold. And a man got up with a minister and a bride, and they got married on top of the engine while there was a small wedding party. And then as soon as the ceremony was over, Franz and crew, they had to strip the train so it could continue along its way. And at the first beat of silence, I said, Franz, that guy who got married on the train, that was my dad. And this was decades before I ever met Franz. And so the guy who is now my best friend in college, when he was my age as a little kid, had decorated this train because my father, who worked for the Burlington Northern, had this great idea that he was just going to stick it to my first mother. He was going to stick it to his first wife by having this enormous wedding on a train that was going to be a big publicity stunt to prove how much more he loved the second woman, Rita, than he loved his first wife, Carol. And at the time, in the mid-70s, I'm there in a leisure suit and some sort of macrame necklace as part of this wedding party, shaking because it's so cold, with this bagpipe player and this screaming bagpipes on top of a train full of angry people in the desert, because my dad just wants this giant stunt. Oh my gosh, my dad's life is just full of these giant stunts. And afterwards, we got off the train, they stripped the train, we went to this Grange Hall for the wedding reception. And the whole thing stayed like a giant unfolding acid trip. It was such a strange day. But then 25 years later, to find myself in school on ecstasy, laying on the floor in a Fleabag hotel, hearing this story from somebody who at that time had been a total stranger, was just so bizarre and disturbing and incredible. And my life is full of those things that are completely implausible, but they happened anyway. Yeah, boy. My father was always doing those gigantic things. For whatever reason. I'm not sure. I think, you know, he was kind of a showman, but he also really wanted to host these experiences for people. Yeah, even if it meant sort of playing the fool, he wanted to create this thing, this event that people would remember as, you remember that time we climbed up on a train and Dad got married and there was that bagpipe player, just everything about it. He just didn't want it to be forgotten.
We're often compensating or overcompensating for childhood things that happened or didn't happen in our, when we were young.
Well,
The love that we didn't get, or in his case, losing his mom at an early age.
he was also one of these garage inventors, and he was always inventing things that he said would deliver us from poverty. He would always hold up the bread tab at breakfast, and he would say, "The man who invented this never ever had to work another day in his life." And so there was always this idea that if you just got one thing right, you'd be on easy street for the rest of your life. And so in a way, I still think that about every book. And so ultimately, every book is a failure because it doesn't deliver me to this kind of ongoing ecstasy and sort of infantilized perfection. But Dad's inventions were always kind of bizarre and dangerous. And my brother and I still laugh about just how we almost got killed by every invention.
And your father, you eventually lost him.
Right, and that's the other odd half of the murder-suicide story, is that Dad was always looking for the right woman. In effect, always looking for his mother, the way he was looking for her the day that she was killed. And he answered a personals ad in a community newspaper, and the ad was the headline was Kismet, which I believe is Arabic for fate. So headline is fate, and it's your standard ad about a quiet, contemplative woman is looking for a man who's not afraid to be a man, and looking for long walks on the beach. And what my father didn't know was that the woman who had ran the ad
This bitch is crazy.
had been a lawyer in the prison system in Missouri. And she'd fallen in love with a prisoner, and she had helped get him out of prison. And she had married him, and he had subsequently molested her daughter. And so she was in the process of having him sent back to prison. And he had vowed that if he ever caught her with another man, he would kill them both. My father had no idea that this was going on. And then later during the trial for this man, the daughter who had been molested by him, she told me that her mother really did not like my father. It's just that he was the biggest guy who answered the ad. That she realized she was in danger, and she needed a really big guy to kind of be her bodyguard and really not know that he was more or less her bodyguard. And so my father had no idea what he was walking into. And at one point, he was going to hide her out at his house in the mountains. So he had cleaned everything in the house. The house was spotless. Everything was perfect. And then he'd gone, picked her up. On the way back to his house, they stopped at a kind of community festival. And the people who saw them at this Lilac Festival said that they seemed very, very happy, very, very in love with each other. And on the way out, they were going to stop by a building, a house that she had under construction, because she wanted to feed some animals that were kept there. She went to the house with him. The ex-husband followed them there. The ex-husband shot them both. They managed to drag themselves into the house. The ex-husband set fire to the house. And the medical examiner said they died of the gunshots, not the fire. But there was a test I didn't want to ask about because it would have been conclusive, and it might have proved that they had died of the fire. And I prefer to think that they died of the gunshots. My siblings could not bring themselves to go to the trial or to watch any of the discovery process. So it was really important for me that in the event that they ever came to me and said, what took place, I wanted to have this meticulous, explanation, and that was that as Dad was on the porch above ground level, he was shot from below, and the bullet entered and pierced his diaphragm. And so for the next 20 minutes, every time he breathed, air got below the diaphragm. And so his lungs had gradually smaller and smaller space because there was more and more air accumulated below his lungs. And so that means that he would have been shorter and shorter of breath for about 20 minutes until he ultimately passed out and died. And so I just really wanted to have this very forensic understanding of the mechanism by which he died. Anyway, they're in this house. They've been shot. The house is on fire. The murderer has left the scene. And ultimately, what saved my father's body was that in the house, he hid underneath a bed, just as he had hidden underneath the bed to avoid his murderous father. And the bed had fallen in such a way that it kind of completely sheltered his body. It kept his body from being burned. And so the parallel between that and his avoiding the original man with a gun who was trying to kill him. Another strange little detail was that on the day he left his house to go pick up his girlfriend, a giant boulder had dislodged from the hillside and had blocked this very, very long driveway. And that my father was so intent on going out that day that he got a block and tackle and he moved the boulder off the driveway. And then to turn the boulder into a kind of landmark to their budding relationship, he got his electric router and he got some wood and he routed a sign that said Kismet Rock, and he painted it and he varnished it and he put it on a stake next to this boulder, which still sits next to his driveway. He made it a little landmark so that when he brought his beloved back, he could point to it and say, that is a reference to your personal Zad. That is a little landmark that stands for our new relationship, our new happiness. And she never saw it. The only people who saw it were my brother and I, who showed up at his house looking for his dental records because they had found this body. Just so much. Anyway, but the perfection of that so many things at the end of his life had paralleled so many things at the beginning of his life, was a really strange, wonderful comfort, because it seemed like a kind of symmetrical inevitability that he should die in exactly this way. Boy, when the medical examiner was showing me the pictures of the body, he said, this is my procedure. He had these crime scene photos, and he put a piece of copy paper over the top. And he said, I'm going to pull the paper aside very, very slowly. And you tell me when you've seen enough. You tell me when to stop. And like Chinese water torture, he starts to pull it, and he's pulling it as slow as the minute hand on a clock. He's pulling it so slow. And I can't tell what little I'm seeing, I can't tell anything. And just out of frustration, finally, I reach out and I grab the paper and I say, enough. Jeez, just let's rip the scab off. And I pulled it to the side, and there's my dad, partially burned up with a big gunshot. He looks terrible, and I can deal with that. I love my father, but I didn't need the slow agony of that slow reveal. He wasn't in the pugilist position, because my first way of understanding anything is to deep dive into all the nuts and bolts. And typically when you die in a fire, your body draws up really tightly. All the joints sort of buckle in, and the hands form fists. And so forensics calls that the pugilist position. Like you're a boxer. And my father had been a boxer. My father had been a champion boxer in the Navy. And the first time I knew that my parents were divorcing for good was when all of his boxing trophies disappeared off the bookcase in the living room. And we never knew what happened to them. Mom just took them and just threw them out. But anyway, that was my dad's death. And the part that I never ever told anybody, because it's the stupid part. The stupid part is only stupid because it doesn't sound like forensics. But I had bought this house, the house I live in now, and it was a giant wreck of a house on this rock outcropping. It kind of hangs over this enormous gorge called the Columbia Gorge. It's like something out of an Edgar Allan Poe novel. The setting is so dramatic. And the house had been fantastically
What do you guys
run down
think?
and had been
Not
owned
feeling
by
it?
hoarders for decades. And so once it was cleared out,
I
we
actually
brought
like it.
in architects and designers and all these people, and the house was completely gut remodeled and filled with a bunch of furniture I'd never seen before. And for about 2 weeks, I lived in an apartment in a barn at the far end of the property. And for 2 weeks, the designer said, you cannot go in the house because we're hanging curtains, we're putting up the wallpaper, we are rolling out the rugs, we're setting everything where it's gonna go. And we wanna have a big reveal. So for 2 weeks, you may not look in the house, you may not go in the house, but every evening you should walk over and check the doors to make sure they're all locked. So for 2 weeks, in the fall of maybe 2010, I would go to the house and I would check all the doors. And then I would take the long walk back to the barn where I was staying. And all the leaves were down, and there were all these really bright horse chestnut leaves, bright yellow. So the ground is brighter than the sky, that incredible sort of lit from below feeling. And as I'm walking back in the evening, I was thinking, boy, I wish my dad was alive to see this house. Dad would just really love this house. And I went back, I went to sleep, I went to bed, and that night I dreamt my father came to me. And my mother had died, my father died in '99, my mother died 10 years later in 2009. And this was in about 2010 that I'm having this dream. And in the dream, my father walks into this apartment that I had in the barn. And he says, for 10 years, I didn't know I was dead. And I walked around, and finally your mother came to me and said, Fred, you're dead. It's okay. Which jives with the fact that after my father's death, my mother kept on having these reoccurring dreams where my father was coming to her door and he'd been shot and he was bleeding. And he would in every dream, he'd say, Carol, can you hide me? You've got to hide me. Someone's trying to kill me. Someone's shot me and he's trying to kill me. And in every dream, my father would shut the door and say, Fred, you did this to yourself, deal with it. But then subsequently, I'm having this dream after they're both dead. And Dad says, I wandered around, your mother came to me, she said, you're dead. And then he said, I'd really like to see your house. Will you show me your house? So we walked back in the dream, through the woods to the house. And we walked through the house, and I'd never been in the house, since it was all staged. And in one upstairs hallway, which has no, there's no sight line to any windows. There was a series of very brightly colored prints. They were these kind of stripes of color, really bold stripes of color on these framed artworks that were hanging on the wall in this kind of upstairs gallery. And they struck me. And then my father walked into a room and he said, I just want you to know that I am more happy than I ever could have been on earth. You cannot imagine the kind of happiness and joy that I exist in all the time right now. And in the dream, he's shirtless and he's very young and he's just glowing. He's glowing like he's made out of gold. He's so bright.
Damn, that sounds
And he
like
says, "Is there anything you'd like to ask me?"
shit.
And in that moment, I had all these, did it hurt? What's it like? Are you in heaven? I had all these questions, but at the same time, I realized that he had demonstrated, through all of his actions, he had demonstrated all these things already. And for me to ask these questions would be kind of insulting, because they would kind of negate all this effort that he had gone to sort of perform how happy he was. And I said, "No, I don't have any questions, but thank you." And he said, "I'm going to lay down and go to sleep." And he lay down across the bed in the master bedroom, and he disappeared. And at that moment, I woke up in the apartment in the barn, and I'm just sobbing. Oh my God. I am just like little kid sobbing, just roaring with tears. And that's the day that the designers are going to walk me through the house that I have not been in. And so I pull it together. I meet the designers. They say, "You're going to love what we've done with this house." They walk me through the house, and then we get to that upstairs gallery hallway. And there are those prints that there's no way I could have seen them. And I'm just staring at them. I can't breathe, I can't speak. They are exactly the prints from the dream. I could not have seen them through any window. They are just completely impossibly there. And I couldn't speak after that. The whole rest of the tour, I just was just following. And later the designer said that the look on my face, they thought I hated it. They thought I was furious, that I hated everything that they had done. And they thought that they just massively failed on all counts. But no, it was because those paintings, those colorful prints were just so inexplicable. Yeah, anyway, they said, "Is there anything you'd like changed?" I said, "Those prints have got to go. I can't live with those." But that is the ridiculous part, and you can't say the ridiculous part. So I collect the ridiculous part. If I'm brave enough, I'll throw that story out, because it will catalyze similar stories from other people. And I collect these stories because anecdotally they don't prove anything, but I'm looking for commonalities between them, because they're just gorgeous and people don't get a chance to tell them because people are very self-conscious about them. And in a way, turning them into words, it kind of dishonors them. It kind of diminishes them to make them into words. But when I hear them, they're just so enormously moving. I collect lots of stories. I collect the workplace hazing stories. People love those. I collect the when did your parents tell you about sex stories, because those form a pattern and they're generally really funny and universally, they're a universal experience. But the stories that people have about being contacted by dead loved ones and inexplicable things that happen are just such impossible stories to tell and to honor, because for whatever reason, but I adore them, and I collect them from everyone.
Do you think the absurd ways that you're father, you know, the things he went through, the way he almost died as a child, and then the terrible murder when he was older. Do you think that's impacted or affected the way that you write now? Looking for these extreme, like almost uncomfortable experiences and stories?
I think it does, because my ongoing sense is that life is so much more enormous and extreme and incredible than we ever are led to believe, or that we are allowed to believe.
And we all have these kind of stories.
Exactly. And they're the kind of stories that just are not sort of deemed appropriate or not deemed believable. And so they tend to be stories that just never really get recorded or turned into a product.
They're never shared.
Exactly. And it's funny, I think we're each raised with a kind of mythology from our parents that tell us about things that happened to us, or things that we did that we're no longer aware of. We don't have the memory itself. And one of my mother's favorite stories was when I was 3 years old.
It's kind of
about
cool,
the
right?
age when my father
I
was
like it,
shot.
damn it.
I developed this huge growth on my neck. And I've never told this story because it's one of those crazy stories that just makes me look like a crazy person. I developed this huge growth on my neck, and our physician, you know, in 1965, thought it was a form of fibrous tuberculosis. And they needed to operate to see if it was this tuberculosis. And so I was taken to Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital, and they gave 3-year-old me a surgery, and I quit breathing. And I stopped breathing during the surgery, and the doctor came out to my mother, who was very early 20s, and said, "We're really sorry, but your child is dead.
Oh, shit.
He's been dead for about 3 minutes. We can't revive him. Little Charles is dead." And my mom sat down and whatever, was in disbelief, and time went by. And sometimes it's 12 minutes and sometimes it's 20 minutes. But eventually the doctor came back out and said, "Your child's alive again. He's started breathing. He's back. We don't know how, but he's back." And so my mother loved to tell that story, because in one moment her kid was dead, and then she was completely in the abyss, and some impossible time later her kid's alive again. And yeah, I have no memory of it, but to tell the truth, not very much has surprised me about my life. I always kind of knew that I would completely sort of waste and fuck up my 20s. And I always knew that something was going to happen to me around the age of 30 to 32. And then I always knew that thing would accelerate. And so part of not being kind of more overwhelmed by becoming a public figure, or becoming a writer, becoming anybody, was this strange half awareness that these things were there. They were just, waiting for me to reach a certain age. A while back, I was in my driveway, and a truck was coming down the highway. It had taken a curve way too fast, and I could see that the tongue on the trailer was bent, and the whole trailer was up on 2 wheels, and it was just about to dump it. This huge trailer full of concrete and boulders and steel. They were tearing down a dam. And I thought, oh, he is going to spill it right there, and the whole thing's going to come sliding into my car. And then suddenly, the trailer overcompensates and tilts the other way towards me, and it's up on 2 wheels on my side. And I think, okay. And part of me thought, this is it. then part of me knew, no, this isn't it. This is not it. Because I'll know when it is it. And the whole thing dumped on my car and crushed my car and threw my car up into the woods. And I was trapped in my car until the jaws of life people came. And the funny thing is that my phone started to ring while I was still trapped in the car, and no emergency services were there yet, just buried in all this rubble. My phone is ringing, and it is my agent, who is a very proper Englishman, and he's saying, "Oh, Chuck, I've got wonderful news for you." And I said, "Yeah, Edward, I'm trapped in my car. It's a Prius. I don't know if it might explode, but I'm all burned up from the airbag powder. My skin is just all raw, and all the glass is shattered, so I'm surrounded by all this safety glass." And Edward's saying, no, it won't take just a moment. I'm thinking, no, seriously, Edward, I'm smashed in this car. I'm not sure if I'm going to burn alive or what. And he goes, no, just let me talk. And he proceeds to tell me that he sold the rights to my novel Haunted for a movie. And he goes, oh, I'll ring off now. And so there was never a word about, good luck getting out of the car. It was just a call from my agent while I'm trapped in the car.
That's funny.
But even in that moment, when I thought this could be it, I knew this wasn't it. That I've had this kind of strange awareness, and I might as well talk about it here, because because my grandmother would always get these really incredibly beautiful crocheted and lace napkins, tablecloths, placemats, and she'd always say, "This is too good to use. This is too nice. We should put this away. It's too nice to use." And then she got diverticulitis, and her colon ruptured, and she died in fantastic pain. And when we went to sort through her house, there were all of these napkins and crocheted collars and placemats and tablecloths. They were too good to use, and they all went to Goodwill. They never got used. So, screw it. If I can think of a story, if I can think of an idea, I've got to find a way to put it in a book. I'm not going to be one of these people who sort of stops the supply by just thinking, I'm going to hold this back, because that's when you quit getting good ideas. That's when you quit hearing good stories, is when you are so holding tightly to the stories that you've got.
You have the censorship of others to combat, to create that problem already.
Well,
you don't need to censor yourself.
In a way, it's others don't even figure into it. They will, I don't care if they like it or they don't like it. What matters is that it gets out there, and it gets out in such a way that it is remembered, that it's that sort of, what do you call it, extremeness of it or the truth of it, that will keep it in the culture long enough that the culture will eventually change and embrace the thing.
You create for yourself, not for your audience.
Exactly. And if you do it right, then you're creating for both, because you're generating a thing that they see themselves in. After my father's death, my father, in his retirement, had been a crazy contest junkie. And he subscribed to all these magazines that told you where to send 1,000 postcards with 1,000 entries for some Campbell soup contest. And so my father would enter all of us kids and all of his peers and all of his siblings and everyone around him in as many contests as he could find. And so after he died, for years, we got this kind of slow trickle flood of little tiny useless things that just came out of nowhere. They were like Campbell soup mugs, and they were like golf towels that were merchandising for a certain brand of cheese. They were all small, sort of pointless things, and they were all called consolation prizes, which I thought was so poignant. That in a way, Dad is dead and we're getting all these prizes that Dad registered us for to console us. And I told that story, and a young woman I worked with who worked for Detroit Art Services, she's so bright, and she got this huge smile, and she said, my dad did that too. My dad was a contest junkie, and after he died, I got little useless things for years and years, and each one was like this sweet little joke from my father. And so when you are able to articulate your experience, you give other people the opportunity to recognize that their experience is not so crazy or silly that they can't talk about it themselves. You give them a permission, you give them an authority by doing so first.
Yeah, you kind of open up the conversation, like we can talk about this kind of crazy stuff, and then it just spreads from there, because we all have them.
And going back to college, there were so many courses I took where no one would really want to discuss whatever we'd been assigned to read. And I remember once sitting in a course about Bertolt Brecht in a room full of 20, 25 college kids, and no one wanted to talk about this Brechtian play. And I thought, I am paying this much money and I'm spending this big chunk of time to sit in a room full of quiet people, none of whom want to look like the idiot. So I would finally just say, you know, I think Brecht, blah, blah, blah. And I'd say some completely outlandish, stupid thing. But it would provoke everyone else to jump in and say, are you an idiot? Are you crazy? No, of course that wasn't Brecht's intention. And the conversation would be started because I threw myself on the hand grenade. I made myself the stupid one. And I think sometimes that's the greatest gift you can do, is to draw enemy fire, to make yourself the stupid one, so that nobody else has to be the stupid one first. And you give them permission to be out there because you've already sort of been the dumb one.
Or told the embarrassing story, or whatever. So your career, as you mentioned earlier, you referred to the path of your life changing in your, was it 20s or 30s?
You know,
because you weren't a writer your whole life.
No, you know, I only wanted to be a writer in grade school because if you got into a certain writing program, you got taken to this camp in the woods, which looked absolutely beautiful. And where we lived in the desert with sagebrush and cactus, boy, the idea of it was at the ocean, going to the ocean to be in all these trees. I didn't care what they did. It could have been a cooking camp. It could have been Satan worshiping camp. I just wanted to go there. It was so beautiful looking. So I started writing poems, trying to get into this camp. Other than that, it was not really a driving one to be a writer until I studied journalism in college because it seemed like a practical way to get in. And journalism wasn't my dream either, because so much of it was about, in a lot of cases, creating conflict. My editor would tell me to lie to city officials and to attribute those lies to other city officials and to create this kind of conflict, and just so I'd have something to report on. And I couldn't bring myself to do that, so I eventually had to leave that job. But
You became a writer. What kind of jobs were you doing before you became a writer?
Went to college, journalism, wrote as a stringer all through college, magazine pieces, wrote for small newspapers, came out of college and went to work for Freightliner. First on the assembly line in Portland, Station 210, building trucks. And I worked there for 3 years before I got promoted to something called the R&M Center, where we ran these enormous machines to study how things broke down, to study how windshield wipers would eventually break, or switches for headlights. These machines that were enormous simulations just ran for days or months or years, so that when they did break down, we could study how they broke down. I wrote repair And I wrote recall and service bulletins and repair procedures, and then traveled around the country teaching them at different dealerships. So that was another 10 years. I was at Freightliner for 13 years.
You became a writer, a serious writer, when?
You know, boy, in the early 90s, I started with a teacher named Tom Spandauer, who was teaching a style called minimalism. And minimalism was so different from the prose fiction that it kind of really put me off of reading. Minimalism was closer to song lyrics. And so minimalism was a great fit. It was also a great fit with the kind of journalistic writing I was doing. So minimalism, and then technical writing, and then I started trying to write a short story called Fight Club, trying to write it more like a song with choruses. It would be 3 verses, a bridge, and choruses. And it worked so well that it really created this style of trying to write short stories and chapters like they were songs. And my teacher, the man who taught me minimalism, he always had us read our work out loud. And so it became more about that kind of performative quality where the story could only be a certain length. And it had to be paced in such a way that it was more like singing a story than it was about reading a story. And that just made all the difference. Suddenly, it was not this prose thing, and it wasn't a poetry thing. It was something in between. It was almost like a movie because it was cut so cleanly by these choruses or whatever devices. And from there, all of my work became this new kind of, almost more like collage than like prose. And that would have been around 1994, 95, because I wrote Fight Club in 94, sold it in 95, book came out in 96. Movie came out in 99. I quit my day job in 98. Yeah.
And Fight Club was your first novel?
No, I'd actually written 2. I'd written a horrible, really very long novel called If You Lived Here, You'd Be Home Already. And that was 800 pages of crap. It was just dreadful. It had 2 scenes that were worth salvaging. And one went into Fight Club. It was the speech that Marla gives about the condom being the glass slipper of a generation. You put it on, you dance all night with a stranger, you throw it away. That got lifted from that first terrible novel and put into Fight Club. And then I wrote a over-the-top sort of road trip novel called Invisible Monsters. And that was based on reading Vogue magazine, these big old fat fashion magazines in the laundromat where I did my laundry every Tuesday. And I just love the chaos of those magazines.
Okay.
Half the pages were numbered, and stories would start, and then they'd jump to the back of the magazine. You could never find them. And as you were trying to find the rest of the story, you would keep paging through, and you would find photographs you'd never seen. No matter how many times you had looked at this magazine, I would continually find these things. And it was back during the era of perfume cards. So it wasn't just chaotic. It was overstimulating. It was confusing. And it had this sort of barrage of different odors that would come out of it as you were going back and forth through these tattered old magazines. And so I'd written this book, Invisible Monsters, based on the dynamics of those magazines, all the sort of chaos in them, and the over-the-top, sort of very florid prose of those magazines. That kind of, I joke that it was like 500 adjectives, all leading up to the word sweater. You had no idea what the thing was until you got to the noun. And that became Invisible Monsters, and got me an agent, and every publisher wanted it. And they flew me to New York, and I did a reading at the KGB bar, and ultimately nobody bought it. No publisher bought it, because they said, our marketing people say they have no idea what shelf it would go on. It's not romance, it's not comedy, it's not literary fiction, it's not horror. They just don't know where it would be stocked in the bookstore. So nobody acquired it. And then, as just kind of an act of sort of rebellion, I wrote Fight Club because I knew they wouldn't buy that either. But I knew that if I did it well enough, they would never forget it. And at that point, it was more about revenge than it was about actually selling anything.
Anger's a great fuel, isn't it?
It's a really great feel. I always tell people when they get dumped, you know, your husband's divorcing you, write a book. This is the best time to write a book.
Absolutely.
Oh, man.
My whole life is built on that. The love I didn't get from my father when I was young is what fueled my whole career in advertising.
It's a great little battery. And
If it's used creatively. I mean, if it's channeled productively.
And also, a lot of people are really afraid of sort of exhausting that battery. But even when you exhaust that battery,
No, it's still,
there's another battery behind it
yeah,
too.
yeah. You break up with a girlfriend and there's another one.
Yeah. There's always some horrible, unresolvable thing that you can go to.
Anger's the best fuel.
Yeah.
It's high octane fuel.
And anger and shame.
Shame too, yeah.
is a little harder to harness, but a lot of my books are really about cringe and shame because I think for young people, that's just a tough place to go to. And if you can be the one that coaches them there, that's a real service.
So tell me about Fight Club. Fight Club seemed to have tapped into something for men that these generations, your generation and younger ones, our generation and younger ones, never had in their lives. We didn't have a great war. We didn't have the Depression to overcome. We didn't have any huge challenges to overcome. And Fight Club seemed to be like almost this man-made challenge for this group of young men in the movie that resonated with everyone, every man.
You know, at the time I was writing it, all my friends were 31. So much so that we joked, we called ourselves the 30 Wonderful Club. And we had all reached the end of the formula. We'd all gone to college. We'd all.
Oh, thanks for the thumbs ups.
We'd all just followed all the steps that were supposed to take you to happiness. And none of us felt like we had done anything but what we'd been told to do. And we've been so obedient and been so high performing, but the rewards just weren't there. And we were at the point where we could either lapse back into inauthenticity, where we just keep playing the game, fully aware that the game's not working, or we do something different. We do something radically different. And so all of us started to just kind of act out in these fairly institutionalized ways. But for me, it was the Cacophony Society, that people on the West Coast had formed these participatory groups where they would stage these big public pranks or throw these giant sort of underground parties. And this was at a time when, before the internet, when these things had to be typed up and mimeographed and mailed to you. And so people would host these giant experiential sort of shit shows. One was the Art Mall, that Portland, Oregon had this first Thursday where on the first Thursday of each month, all the art galleries were open and all of the sort of Jordache wearing yuppies would drink wine and eat cheese and wander from one gallery to another. And Cacophony, we decided that we knew of a gallery that was failing, and we were going to get that gallery for one night for a first Thursday. And so we went around to every thrift store and we got the worst, cheesiest, most atrocious, obscene art that we could find. just complete thrack. And we staged this whole gallery with all of this really terrible, terrible art. And we had these bad performance artists, and we had these incredibly bad mimes. We had every art cliche we could find. And I remember one friend, Janet, she had these words on pieces of paper. And as people entered, she would give them a piece of paper and she would say, you must use this word at least 5 times before you leave the gallery. And I remember somebody got the word phallocentric, but they were all these really highfalutin art theory words. And all these very nice intentioned Jordache wearing yuppies came parading through our gallery and were initially appalled and angry that they'd been duped into this big joke. But that ultimately everyone was in our gallery and the place was packed and you could not get in because it was really a lot of fun and everyone just loved our bad art gallery that was open one day, La Art Mall, and then just disappeared. But Cacophony, they would create, they would float these ideas, these stunts. Burning Man was a Cacophony thing. Burning Man is probably the most high-profile Cacophony Society thing that was sort of co-opted or adopted by the culture. And Santa Rampage was another, where everyone would dress as Santa Claus and just perform these giant stunts and these huge public sort of drunken spectacles with everyone sort of negating race and gender by all dressing with these huge beards and these big fat suits. Santa Rampage, La Art Mall, Apocalypse Cafe. They would send these moving trucks, these old Ryder trucks, around to different points in the city, and you would have to show up with like a potluck hot dish, and you would have to dress for a potluck at the end of civilization. And the truck would pull up, and the back would roll up, and we realized we would have to get into this truck, which is illegal. And we would have to be sort of trusting enough that we would be trucked around to wherever this huge secret party was. And so everyone was sitting in the back of these big dark trucks crammed together with baked beans and all these other hot dishes. And then eventually the trucks would, open up and we'd be in some giant warehouse. But it was these giant sort of pre-rave events that Cacophony staged. And that was a big sort of early sort of inspiration for Fight Club. This idea of a structured consensual chaos that you could enjoy for a very small part of your weekend, and then go back to your boring life on Monday.
Did Fight Club start as a short story?
It did. It was a short story I wrote at my desk one afternoon when I was bored. I tweaked it a couple times, but more or less chapter 6 is that short story that I wrote in one sitting, one day.
The gem comes out of one little sit down.
Well, it's kind of, I've read a lot about lyricists who get more or less an entire song in one sitting. And in one case, I'm thinking of John Denver. He got into a fight with his wife, and he decided he was going to ride the ski lift up to the top of the mountain. And just in the course of that one ride on the ski lift, he came up with the entire, I think it was Annie's song. It was that song where he was really singing about his love of his wife with whom he's just had this fight. But it was the song that was sung at every single one of my peers' weddings. Through the 70s into the 80s, everyone had someone sing Annie's song. You Fill Up My Senses, Like a Night in the Forest, like the mountains in springtime, like a walk in the rain, like a storm in the desert, like a sleepy blue ocean. You fill up my senses, come fill me again. Come, let me love you, let me give my life to you. Let me drown in your, drown in your, anyway, that entire song came to him in one ski lift ride. Yeah, and I think that that is the case when an idea strikes. One hallmark of a good idea is that it strikes fully and it strikes very fast. The whole thing comes together in an instant.
But it's the culmination of years of experiences in life
It is,
that leads to it.
but at some point, unless there's a sense that it's come from something else, that it's not so much you putting it together, it is you channeling something, you kind of providing a kind of reception for something. That is, I think, the most hallmark thing. That if you're too aware of what it is, or you feel like you're really laboring over it, that doesn't bode well. For years, I wrote back and forth with the writer Ira Levin. Because Ira Levin was just really a hero in our family. You know, before Stephen King, Ira Levin was the horror writer. And Ira Levin liked my book Diary and endorsed it, so we started writing back and forth. And I was always asking him if Rosemary's Baby, which is arguably his biggest book, whether it was really, it seized public attention, it hit so big because it was expressing the tragedy and the horror of thalidomide. And he would never say yes or no. He did say that in the early 60s, he had wanted to write about the horror of being pregnant, but not really realizing the nature of what you were pregnant with. And he said that there'd been a book called The Midwich Cuckoos about a bunch of young women in the same village becoming pregnant all on the same night. And it was ultimately made into The Village of the Damned as a movie. Nobody knows The Midwich Cuckoos, but they know Village of the Damned. And since it had been done with aliens, he couldn't go there. And so he had just kind of gone to the devil as a default. But when you read Rosemary's Baby, there's some really telling little details. At one point, Laura Louise is knitting booties, and Rosemary Woodhouse is looking at these booties, and she's thinking, boy, Laura Louise is a terrible knitter, because these look like they're booties for something with flippers or claws. And what she's describing is more or less the sort of signature deformations caused by thalidomide. These people who now call themselves flids, like Lobster Boy, had these sort of truncated hands and arms that were more like a claw, like a lobster's claw. And so there's so many things in Rosemary's Baby that point to thalidomide that I couldn't help but think that, you know, people are not really freaked out about a woman being raped by the devil. They are being allowed to be freaked out about this huge tragedy they cannot talk about with thalidomide. They can't, there's no way to resolve this enormous 20-year horror. We're gonna have to live with it. It's gonna be with us. But we've got to find some enormous cathartic way to vent our sadness, our anger, our everything around it. And so when Rosemary's Baby came out, and we couldn't even see the baby in the cradle because it was too shocking, I know that Ira Levin was writing about thalidomide, and that he would get crucified if he ever got caught. Crucified for exploiting this tragedy. And so I think, in a way, maybe Ira didn't even know he was writing about it. But I think after the fact, you always recognize it. It might take you years, but you always recognize what you were really writing about. And I think that if you did know about it, you would not go to the fullest extent that you should. It needs to remain a mystery to you, or you just won't go there. It's about tricking yourself to go there first, and then tricking other people to go there.
Do you ever censor yourself? Just think this is a little bit too out there?
Oh, I always censor myself. Oh my God. I really like Joe Rogan. I think he's a great conversationalist and he's funny
He's incredible.
and it's a great show to be on. But the last time I was on there, we started riffing down this road about how do you know when your dick is too big? And I said, it's too big when it hangs in the water. And Rogan goes, we're just tossing back and forth to each other. And Rogan goes, yeah, but it's never too big. Because then what you do is you gotta go out and find a gal who's like, has 6 kids. And it won't be too big for her. So you just gotta go out and find one of those gals with a big stretched out pussy. And I so wanted to toss back. And I'm like, well, Joe, you ever been one of those football player guys? Those guys take forever to fuck. You ever fisted one of those guys who's like taking it up to the elbow? Yeah, it's like throwing a sausage down a hallway. Joe, you ever been, one of those great big guys? The powerlifter guys? They got a gape on them like this. And I think he would have laughed.
You would have.
But I think his audience would have just been so scandalized. And I just thought, self-censor.
My audience can handle it.
I think your audience can. And that's why I think you're, yeah.
I love doing this because I feel total freedom. Like I'm not getting pushback from really anybody. Like YouTube seems to be pretty good with allowing me to put almost anything up. Some things I can't, but mostly I can.
The one I liked the most was the Playboy Playmate.
Mm-hmm.
The disconnect between what she was talking about and her kind of blithe, glib way of talking was wonderfully tragic and train wrecky.
But talking about it like she's talking about everyday stuff.
Exactly.
What she's going to order for lunch.
But then I noticed that you had a kind of, that said a censored version and a not censored version.
Yes.
And
She was naming so many names.
Oh my gosh.
She was outing all kinds of people. So I just figured, it's just going to cause all kinds of headaches.
Is that anywhere?
It's on my subscription channel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Did you get pushback when you're working with, like, when Fight Club became a film? There must have been pushback on some scenes there, right?
There was only pushback on the Marla Singer's infamous line.
When they're in bed?
Was that?
When they're in bed?
Yes. And she said she's supposed to say, I want to have your abortion. And even Brad Pitt chimed in. He said, my mom's going to see this movie. I don't want that line. And so Fincher changed it to, I haven't been fucked like that since grade school. And at that point, 20th Century Fox jumped in and said, that's worse. And Fincher just put his foot down and said, no, that's the line. So.
That's great. When you're in these writers groups, what kind of thing, are those helpful to be working with other writers and bouncing ideas back and forth? Or is there some bumping heads there too with your freedom?
Well, initially it was wonderful because it gives you a little party. It gives you a social reward every week for having produced work. And so when you're not getting, any kind of, you're not selling anything, you just want to be heard. And also you want to check for clarity. I want to make sure that when I press the language and when I really mess with the language, it's still clear what I'm depicting. And so writers group are really good for that. They're also really good for cultural precedent, because nobody wants to get 100 pages into something and then realize that they've just written Charlotte's Web. Somebody in the group is going to be able to say, oh, I saw something like that in a movie like this. And so really early on, you're able to give up ideas rather than repeat something that people already know. So it gives you a social reinforcement for doing it. It gives you a check on your clarity. It gives you access to a larger cultural precedent. It gives you a certain small amount of useful feedback. Typically, there's not enough writers in workshop who can articulate why a thing does or does not work. So most of the time you're listening to people say, I really liked this part, I really didn't like this part, and that's completely useless. You want to know how to fix it. You want to know what needs to be fixed and how to fix it. But most recently, our workshop broke up because of political correctness. I was writing a short story, turned more or less into a novella, called Inclinations. And it's about a kid who wants a Corvair, who wants a Corvette. So he asks his father for a hamster for his birthday. And then he gets his hamster, and then he says the hamster's got away. But gradually he stages it so that all these hamsters disappear, and his parents find a big thing of half-filled thing of Vaseline in his room, and he's coaching them to think he's putting hamsters up his butt. And they finally confront him and they say, "Are you putting hamsters up your butt?" And he's like, "No." And so they say, we want to send you to this conversion therapy. And he says, I'm not going. He's straight, he's heterosexual, he's just a kid. But he leads them to believe that he is homosexual through these kind of stereotypical hamster things. He's actually putting the hamsters out the window. But he finally says, okay, if you buy me a Corvette, I will go to this reorientation therapy. And so he thinks the whole thing is going to be about being shown pornographic movies and plied with hookers and shot with steroids, and he cannot wait. And at the end of all this, he gets a Corvette. So he walks into it as this whole scam on his parents. And it's a great story. It works really well. That's just the tip of the iceberg. But there are protesters outside the gate of this. And I use the word "fat" in the story. And one of my best friends in the workshop, a very best-selling writer, Chelsea, she said, no, you can't use the word "fat." Nope. I said, we're writers. You know, I'm same-sex attracted. Why can't I use the word "fat"? And Chelsea says, because we meet in my house, and you're not going to say the word "fat" in my house. I said, we're cutting ourselves off the knee if we cannot, if we start sort of dictating what words we cannot use. It was so frustrating. And Chelsea said, no, if you're going to bring in work with the word "fat," we're not meeting here, and I don't want to be part of workshop anymore. And workshop more or less fell apart that night. With this discussion of what was going to be allowed and what was not going to be allowed. And we had depicted, Chelsea writes about a serial killer named Gretchen who vivisects her victims. And they're alive, and the lungs are inflating and deflating, and the positive bowel movements are happening in the intestines, and the whole thing is alive and steaming while Gretchen is torturing this man to death. And I'm like, yeah, we're allowing that, but we don't allow fat.
That's the one word on YouTube that I cannot use.
Really?
It's the one word.
It's funny because
that I know of.
I go to my phone and I try to put in obscene words or forbidden words. In fact, the one word the phone will take and won't autocorrect. So I just find that so fascinating. But that was the downfall of our workshop. And I think it'll get better. I think people are moving beyond that. I was at a Barnes & Noble in Skokie, Illinois. It's like the flagship Barnes & Noble for the Chicago area. And I think it was for my book, Rant. And I was telling these ribald stories that people had told me, that a lot of these stories came in on letters. And there was one guy, he was a painter in Denver. And he was really proud. He did really the very best prep work. He said he didn't do any spray work. It was all brush work. Just, he was, you know, a fantastically good house painter. And he had had a really checkered life. He'd done a lot of intravenous drugs, and he ended up HIV positive. And he wasn't married, wasn't in a relationship. He had this little pug dog that he just adored. He loved this little dog. And every night before he fell asleep, he would jerk off in bed, and he'd clean up with a wad of Kleenex, and he'd drop it off the side of the bed. And every morning he'd look down, and there'd be the pug dog shredding the Kleenex. And I kind of shot myself in the foot here, because at this point he didn't know he was HIV positive. But he goes in for a test for new insurance or something, and they say, you've got to come in for a face-to-face, and that's never good. So he goes in for a face-to-face, and they're talking about, you know, extending his life and treatments and regimens and on and on. And all he can think of is, every morning for God knows how many years, my dog has eaten those Kleenex. Oh my God, I gave my dog AIDS. And he's just completely freaked out. It doesn't matter whether he's sick or he might die. He is just completely traumatized over the idea that he might have killed this thing that he loves the most. And so while the social worker is still prattling on and on and on, he finally just says, you've got to stop, just stop. I only need to know one thing. I only need to know just one thing. Just stop, just shut up. And she stops. And it's clear she's got this sort of saintly look. She's given this talk so many times. And he goes, I just need to know, could I have given AIDS to my pug dog? And he says in that moment, the look on her face just hardens. It's not a smile anymore. It's just like a muscle cramp. And he says he can actually hear her chair creak, this wooden chair, because she's so pushing herself back, trying to distance herself in this invisible way. And the room is deadly quiet. And then dawns on him, he goes, oh, she thinks I fucked my dog. Oh my gosh, she thinks I fucked my pug dog. And he goes, you think I fucked my dog? Oh, no, it's not like that. And he tells the story about the Kleenex and about the dog eating the Kleenex. And at that point, the social worker goes from this complete disgust to this enormous relief. And she starts to laugh. And she says, no, there's a reason it's called HIV and not DIV. It is human immunosuppressive virus, not dog immuno. And the two of them are so overwhelmed with relief and joy in this moment that his dog's not going to get sick and she's not counseling a guy who fucks dogs. That after that, HIV is just something they can deal with. They're both so happy and life goes on. And the guy was writing to me years and years after the fact, and he still seems to be very well. I love that story, but I told that story at a Skokie Barnes & Noble. And by the time I'd signed the last of the people, it was 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning, and the store people, the staff were no longer speaking to me. They were so angry about that story. And the next day at my hotel, my editor from Random House called and just reamed me out. Said, how dare you tell that story? That was disgusting. everyone in Barnes & Noble is so put off by you and so angry about that they are raising holy hell here at Random House. You may never tell that story again, blah, blah, blah. And I was really called on the carpet for it. But I love that Pug Dog story.
You're doing the right thing, I think.
For a while, I was telling a story called Guts. And the very first time I told it, and I almost said I stole it because it was based on 3 true stories told to me by friends over decades. But the first time I told it was in the basement of a library in San Francisco. And it was a huge number of people. It was packed and people fainted. And there was one young man, he must have been about 13 or 14, and he was Asian. And he was there with an incredibly elegantly dressed Asian woman. And I assumed that she was probably a grandparent who had brought him to the event. And as they came up in the signing line, the kid's got his book, and I'm signing his book. And at that point, the elderly woman leans in. And this sounds terrible, but with her accent, she said, I tell my grandson, don't you never ever stick nothing up your penis. And this poor kid is just dying. He's just wilting like, oh, fuck. Grandma. And you could tell that she drove him there and that she's going to be sharing that story with him for the rest of his life. Oh, it was such a wonderful, heartbreaking moment. The look in that poor kid's face. But yeah, that was a moment. But out of that same event, a woman came up, and she'd come a huge distance. I believe it was from Coos Bay, Oregon. And she told a story about how when she was in 2nd grade, she'd been a brownie. And brownies are a precursor to Girl Scouts. And you get a little brown hat, and you have to earn merit badges. And each week you meet at a different brownie's house. And she was not a popular kid. She had very few friends in 2nd grade. But once she got a stomach ache, and her mother kept her out of school, and at the time, this would have been in the 60s, they had a heating pad with this vibrating function. And so she had to sleep on her stomach with the heating pad on her stomach. And somehow during the night, the heating pad slid down between her legs, this gentle, warm, vibrating thing. And she said she woke up with the most fantastic, incredible feeling. Just glorious, like nothing she had ever experienced. And so the next time it was her turn to host the brownies, she said, brownies, you got to come to my house. You all got to try this heating pad thing I invented. It's amazing. And so all the brownies rode this heating pad, and they all had these fantastic experiences. And she said after that, every brownie meeting was at my house. Every girl in the 2nd grade wanted to play at my house, and it was like Sex and the City for 7-year-old girls. And we all got along, and for that one bright, shining moment, I was the most popular kid in my class. Until the one day my mom came home from work early, and she caught us with the heating pad. And she very politely asked all the brownies to leave. And when they were all gone, she grabbed the cord and she yanked it out of the wall. And went at me, just beat me with that cord.
Oh.
My mom just beat me with that heating pad cord, that electrical cord. And she just beat me and beat me and beat me. And the whole time she was beating me, she was saying, you slut, you dirty, dirty bitch, you dirty, dirty whore. What kind of a fucking whore am I raising? And the woman who's telling me this story is not telling it in a tragic way. She's telling it in a kind of way that something is shifted. And it's because I've read that gut story in which, in the first person, I'm talking about a character who puts a carrot up his butt, and another character who puts a length of wax down his penis, and another character who's disemboweled by a swimming pool filter. But since I read it in the first person, I'm more or less embodying all of these acts. And she says, this woman with a heating pad, she says, if you can tell those stories about, jerking off in a swimming pool, if you can tell those stories and make people laugh at them about what you did, then I can tell my heating pad story. And I can make that story a story that people laugh at. And that ultimately, she said, I have not had an orgasm since the second grade, but maybe someday I'll be able to have an orgasm. And beyond that, maybe someday I can go back to my mother and I can say, do you remember that heating pad we had? And I can complete this enormous incomplete with my mom. And so that's another big aspect of why I write what I write, because our entire lives can be about this enormous effort to look good and to always look good and to never sort of show any kind of belly. But if we recognize that, that gives us a freedom to really show belly when we want to, and to kind of be of service to people, and to be able to kind of throw away the really kind of small things that we find ourselves on occasion. I find myself getting smaller and smaller and smaller as I get smarter. And it really takes a kind of sort of self-immolating story to kind of blow me back out so that I'm really in the world again. And so it's about reading a story in which I kind of throw away all human dignity. And in turn, I'm given something greater than this small sort of looking good thing that I was up to that moment. And also you do that service for your readership or for your audience, because you give them the same freedom to kind of step out of looking good for a moment and throw everything away.
That's great. What are you proudest of in your life?
What am I proudest of in my life? My marriage. Yeah. I can't believe 30 years. Yeah, it's
30 years.
30 years. 10 years married, but 20 years together before that. And it's been a strange 30 years, because when we were first together, I wasn't really a writer. So we both had to kind of, experience this strange seismic shift.
How has your life changed since you became a well-known writer, as opposed to being an employee at Freightliner?
The biggest way my life has changed is that the weather is so much nicer now. Because when I worked at Freightliner, I could only go outside during certain moments of certain days. And if it was raining during that time, it was raining. And now I can go outside anytime the sun shines. So now my perception of the weather is that the weather is infinitely better than it used to be. Because it used to be that I got what I got. There were only so many hours that I could go out and be in the world. And now I can be in the world anytime I want. So I get to choose when I enjoy the weather, and the weather seems that much nicer.
What are you working on now?
What am I working on? I'm working on a science fiction novel that is really strange, because I loved science fiction as a kid, and I really want to take a shot at it in completely reinventing it in an oddball way. And I've been commissioned by the Steppenwolf Theater Company of Chicago to write a play. I've always wanted to write a play because a play seems like the ultimate form of minimalism. Every aspect, every element in a play, the characters, the settings, the time, everything is so limited, and you have to do so much with such limited stuff that a play has always been my dream. And so I'm already writing the play. We haven't even started meetings, but Steppenwolf.
Chuck, what would you say is the most important lesson you've learned in your life?
Most important lesson: to take responsibility for my own experience. That sounds really abstract, but I'm never going to work a job I hate without finding a way to like it. Even when I was on the assembly line at Freightliner, there were all these fantastic jokes that I would play, and that I would sort of prompt other people to play. The vendor reps who came by with like New Way axles and different, Cummins engines. These vendor reps would always bring these huge cardboard boxes full of donuts, the most elaborate filled donuts you could imagine. Just every kind of cruller, everything Bavarian cream, everything jelly, just huge, like 40 pounds of gorgeous donuts. And they would put them open on somebody's workbench in the factory. And it was always a blast to take the grease gun and to put the grease gun in where the Bavarian cream was injected, and to shoot the donut full of axle grease, and then to put some powdered sugar over that spot to hide it and put it back in the box. And then for everybody to hide behind the parts racks and wait for somebody to take just that donut and to bite into it and get a big mouthful of axle grease. Because you can't spit out axle grease, it sticks to everything. And so the person would bite down, get this moment of horror, this gagging, vomiting look, and then instantly look around because they knew they were being watched. And then this fantastic rage, this person with a mouthful of axle grease that they couldn't spit out would then be looking for tools to beat someone with, and everyone would be laughing and running. That was fun. The other thing I loved to do was buy these little really adorable stuffed animals, because so often when you're running wiring harnesses or other things that you have to run through the frame rails of a truck, you can't really see where you're reaching. You just have to reach sort of shoulder deep to try to find the component or find the loose thing, whatever you're working on. So you're reaching blindly into these deep, dark spaces. And the truck building plant also had a rat problem. So there was always this terror that you can reach into these places and there would be a rat. And so taking a small stuffed animal and putting it at this inaccessible place, so someone would reaching in to work an airline or something, they would grab this fuzzy thing and instantly, in terror, think it was a rat. But then ultimately discover it was this adorable stuffed animal. And everybody who worked at the plant, they either had small kids at home who would love that animal, or they had a girlfriend who would love that animal. So it would be something that would morph from a moment of complete terror to a moment of complete joy as they realized that they could gift this to someone who would really love it. So it was those kind of jokes that made working at the plant a lot of fun. And no matter what job I've had, it's always been about, my first priority is, how do I make this fun? How do I take responsibility for my experience and make this task something that I will enjoy?
As Dudley Moore said in the movie Arthur, fun is the best thing to have.
Fun, yes. Or money, yeah.
All right. Chuck Palahniuk, thank you so much.
How long did we go? Jeez.
Okay, we're going. We're still going, dude. We ain't stopping.
Ed Greenwood, and I think Elminster was somewhere here walking around at some point, right? Exactly.
Okay.
So we're going to talk just about so your history of the stuff that you've been through. Do you have anything just like a cool story or just a memory or something that just no one or probably we would love to hear about?
I think the coolest one was at a Milwaukee area Gen Con years ago. I was running a charity table.
Okay.
And TSR would ask me to do this because they knew I could do a sort of no rules freeform. So if you had the mayor of Milwaukee or somebody who'd never played before, you could just sit in and play D&D and understand it wasn't a satanic game.
Yeah.
And they didn't have to have the rule books, they didn't have to know anything. I would tell them, roll that D20, roll that D12, and just tell them what happened. So it's like freeform storytelling.
Okay.
And there was this very brilliant, nerdy young girl who was there at Gen Con, and she was obviously, she begged her parents, and they were helicopter parents.
Oh, right.
Okay, you know, they were watching, is their little girl gonna, you know, and the father drifted away because he started seeing all this cool stuff you could buy.
Squirrels.
So he's off shopping.
Yeah.
The mother is hovering. She's playing at the table. She's the only female at the table, and she's the only young person at the table. Everybody else at the table looks like me, or maybe not white hair, but you know, we're all overweight, t-shirts with inappropriate things on them, facial hair and stuff, and she's a little nervous. And I'm thinking, okay, I don't want her to get bullied, like, do this, you know, by other veteran players. So I head out the characters and she chooses the power.
Oh.
So I'm going, great. So Paladin to the floor. You know, she's
the leader.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the whole group of them, they go too far into the dungeon.
Oh.
And they're down to 3 hit points and 2 hit points.
God.
And they have stirred up the hornet's nest of orcs.
Oh, God.
So there's orcs coming at them by the hundreds, by the thousands. They're not going to make it out.
Right.
And they suddenly realize, we can't go on just pretend we're the heroes, we're going to win. We got to run. We have to run, or we're going to die.
Right.
And now they're getting sniped at by the orcs, and the orcs are take bleeding hit points off them as they go. They flee through.
Retreating.
Yeah, and they finally come to this really narrow bit, and the poor little girl tears up because this was her first convention. This was her first chance to shine. Maybe her first chance to play D&D
Right.
with other people.
Right.
And she so wanted to have a victory. But to her, she'd gotten role playing. She understood acting. So what would the paladin do? You know?
Right.
So she turns in this narrow doorway and she says, goodbye, my friends. It was nice knowing you. And she holds the narrow door and she is weeping. And sure enough, she goes down. And of course, her mother hears her little girl crying and comes running just as all these big, hairy guys lift the ashes of defeat to, I belong.
Yeah.
I did something. I achieved something. Suddenly, I'm famous or the center of attention and people are looking up to me. Older people are looking up to me. Now I'm getting my back slapped and my hand shaken by all these big, hairy guys. They're like half a generation older than me. I've made it. I'm one of them.
Yeah.
You know, and then to see the mother's face. Oh, my brilliant baby girl who is a misfit. You know, she's accepted. She suddenly has new friends. She's a hero and she has new friends. And the game did that. The game gave her a whole bunch of new friends. And of course, they're going to meet again at later Gen Cons. They're going to play together. They're friends now. You know, they're equals.
Yeah.
And she did it. They know, these guys know that she will lay down her life for them. So she's suddenly okay in their books. And the father arrives with his arms full of stuff. And he goes, what happened? You know,
Oh my goodness.
you know, but she's beaming, you know, and it's
That's exactly what D&D, what I want to share.
Yeah.
And that story right there.
Yeah.
Imagine that coming to life.
yeah.
And we could bring that with Geek
Yeah,
Night.
yeah.
We could bring this amazing
Oh, yeah.
epic moment. And that's one thing that as the Geek Night community, and when you go to Kickstarter, you'll see what we're talking about. You as fans, us as DM, as players, when you join our community, you get to submit your best story, your best one shot. Then we take those top 10 and we put it out there to let you guys vote on it.
How
And think
cool.
about that. Episode 8, every season is a fan-based one shot. And you might, this one, I don't even know if we can beat that one, Ed. You might have already sealed the first season because the power of seeing that little girl and her emotion and her standing there as a paladin. And imagine her seeing that come to life, going into
Oh,
the
yeah.
screen and seeing her character in this awesome
Oh,
thing
yeah.
that she created, holding that door as her friends are getting
Yeah.
away to live. And that's what we want to share. And that's the power of D&D, and that's what I want to share with this. So we have all our tight-knit community that knows this, but then you have those people that they don't understand the game.
Yeah.
It's getting out there a little bit,
Yeah.
so we want to bring that to them.
Yeah, and on a more mundane level, without, you know, the youth coming out of its shell. I mean, do your
Yeah.
coworkers or the people at school with you, do they really get what you do if they're not gamers? You know, does your grandma really know? And you go, I don't know if I should spend all this money on this thing for you for Christmas. Because, you know, this is pretty weird. And if you go online and you show her these vast assembly halls of people shopping, or a table with a bunch of guys sitting around it with paper and dice and maybe a pop can or something on the table, it's like, what are you doing? But then your stuff, when you do a clip and then the person will say, that's me, see? And that's my character. Look what, and it's like, oh, you're in a movie. Yeah, but look what's happening.
Look what my character
Yeah,
does.
look what my character does.
Yeah.
And then they go, okay, I get why you spend all this money on this. I get why you spend this time in the basement with your friends. I get all that now because look, you get to be the hero.
It's magical. It's
Yeah.
magical. Well, that hopefully we can share that and get that out there.
Yeah.
Anyway, for sharing that story, that was the whole cast that I cast. They're all D&D players. I had everyone share their most epic, sad, powerful, funny moments, and you just get these emotions.
Yeah.
You immediately, I saw you go back to
Oh,
that
yeah,
time.
yeah,
And
I'm
you go
tearing
into
up.
that.
I remember it
Exactly.
because it was so special to that little girl, and you realize, I'm changing a life here. Heavy responsibility time, you know, but I'm changing a life here.
Yeah.
You know.
Exactly. Oh, okay. All right, guys.
Yeah.
October 24th, Kickstarter. We're gonna do this. We're gonna make this.
Everybody, what? And I went, I was ripping his face and just letting him have it.
Okay.
Bruises everywhere. And when we got in the back, I looked at him, he looked at me. It's beautiful. It's art. If I made you believe, brother, then I did my job. I'm Bob at home, but in the ring, I'm supernatural.
Is that right?
Yes.
How long have you been supernatural instead of Bob? I guess it's only when you wrestle, right?
Only when I wrestle. A lot of people ask me, hey, they ask my siblings, hey, it's the same way he is in the ring as he is at home. Of course, I don't take the gimmick home.
In the ring, you're a character.
Right. I'm a heel. Or in lucha terms, I'm a rudo. A bad guy.
Rudo.
So I'm the guy that everyone boos. So my applause are the boos.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm getting booed or people are trying to puncture my tires outside or throw shit at me, then I'm doing my job.
You're doing a good job.
Yes.
What is it about, like, professional wrestling and lucha libre, which is the Mexican form of it, that, people say it's fake?
I believe it's a good question. I've been doing my research. When people say fake, I think a lot of marriages are based on agendas. I think the marriages are fake. I think sometimes when boxing, you're trying to bring in a new kid and a lot of people love him and his merchandise is selling. And I had a lot of people ask me, who do you think is going to win the fight? And I go, well, that guy's on his way out, this guy's on his way in. So it's politics. I think the new kid's going to win. So if the new kid's going to win, that tells me it's fake. It's set up. It's in general. I notice when guys lose their fortunes, the women says, for some reason I don't love you anymore. Of course you don't love me anymore. Because that wasn't the feeling, you had an agenda. So when we talk about wrestling, saying, is it fake? The miles are real. The money's real. The bumps are real.
What you guys go through in the ring is
Oh, yeah,
amazing.
it's 365 days 24/7. I mean, you're conditioning yourself. You're getting up there. You're always trying to look the part, and you're always trying to look conditioned. Of course, when new blood comes in, when I came in, I used to go up to the old guys and say, "Hey, how am I doing?" You know, I always went up to them as a father figure. "How am I doing?" And they go, "Well, you're doing okay." And little did I realize, I must ask that question over and over. "How am I doing?" "You're doing okay." And I got the same response, and I said, "Man, what am I doing wrong?" So then I took a step back and I said, "Wait a minute. I didn't realize that I'm going to take his place one day. And I'm the new dog." So an alpha is not going to tell the pup, "Hey, you're coming up." The alpha's always going to tell you, "Hey." So that's when I stopped asking him, and I started hearing it from the fans. So anytime I'm up there and they're popping, you know, they're just grabbing on me, I'm letting them in, and I walk out and I always hear, he used to call me the show guy. "Hey, you did a lot of show up there, but you didn't do shit." And I go, "I thought the name of the game was to get over, because you're doing all these flips and shit, and they're quiet. I don't hear anything. I mean, I'm in the back warming up, you know, getting ready. Is there a match going on?" But as soon as I get out there, they just start going crazy. And then they gave me a nickname. And I don't like the nickname, but hey, it's gonna get me over.
What's the nickname?
The nickname is an artist in Mexico. Her name is Paquita. You know, she's a short woman, her hair's blonde, and she's always scorned, and all her songs are about how men did her wrong. So as soon as I come out, instead of playing my music, they play her song. And then instead of calling me natural, they start calling me Paquita, Paquita. What the? They're like, "What is it?" He goes, "Because your hair's blonde, bro. And you have that style." Man, what a way to go. However, I was everywhere I went, they were sticking. And everywhere I went, they were popping. So if I did a move on a guy and I was doing really well and I looked for approval, instead of them rooting for me, the DJ guy would play music. And it was like more insult than anything, like playing her song and then making me feel like I'm not a woman and I'm not the scorned woman, and then I don't look like her, she don't look like me, but it was getting over. So one thing I learned about this business is it's not about what you know also, but it's about you getting over. You know, you don't have to do a lot, but if you have the charisma and you have that persona when you enter a room, or you do a meet and greet, and you do an autograph, "Wow, Nacho, I saw you on TV, and I see you, man, you even look better, you know, than I see you on TV." I go, "Yeah, they gain about 15 pounds on TV, doggy, you know?" But yeah, they get excited. Then I had the high flyers next to me, about 150 pounds, 160 pounds. And they would ask me, "Are they wrestlers?" "Yeah, of course they are. They're on this house." But they don't look the part. So I always tell my students, "Hey man, hit the gym, bro. You know, 'cause this is a circus. In circus, you have to look above and beyond. You can't look like that, you know, like a backup cook at McDonald's or anything. You can't look like that. You have to have that look where, wow, this guy can really fucking dismember me." So when I started,
And that's you,
and I
Mijo?
ran into Gil's Garage when I got there, and they told me they do Lucha Libre there. You know, he's the veteran, the head honcho there. You know, I was telling you earlier that when I was about 7 years old, they had wrestling in Whittier Boulevard. And my mom took me there. Little did I know that was the same guy I was going to run in years later. So when I arrived to Gil's, and I said, "Hey, I'm an enthusiast. I want to learn how to do lucha." He looked me up and down. He says, "Maybe you'll last a week." I go, "Why? Why would you say that?" "Nah, I have widows coming here all the time, thinking they're going to be something, and then they fucking quit." I said, "Okay." So as soon as I got there, he put me through the test. I'm not going to lie to you. It was murder. He says, if you can't feel it, just powder out. Of course, he also has a rule. If you want water, if you get water, you can't come back into the ring. That's just the way it is. I go, "Well, I have to hydrate." He goes, "Maybe that's how it works out there, but that's not how it works in here." So it took me over 6 to 7 months to master his whole training session to 2 hours straight, because it was intense. And I'm this big dude with these little guys, and they have energy for days. So I was getting discouraged. I'm like, man, you know, what do I need to do? And of course, I'm a baby in the
Lose weight.
business. As I matured, I started to realize you don't have to do them, you just got to do you. So as a baser or a heel, I don't know if you notice when you watch, there's guys that catch them.
Mhm.
Well, that would be me. So I said, okay, now I have a purpose. So when I would train with the cruiserweights, I said, hey, just dump them and I'll catch you. Okay. Go this way and I'll flip. All right. Now I found my purpose. Now my regimen, I'm still doing what they're doing, but now I'm different. I'm almost their
He's like
guardian angel.
nervous.
Because when they fly, you know, this business you got to catch. You don't eat and I don't eat.
You can hit the concrete if you don't.
Yes. So I got to make sure he's okay and I'm okay so we can continue to do the next show over. Now, usually I would not tell you this, but since we have social media, that the rule is not supposed to talk about this, they're talking about it every day now. You know, they got a bad guy and a good guy having dinner together, feeding each other food. Come on, it was never heard of it back in the day. Back in the day, you would go in one side of the building, and I have to go the other side of the building. Back in the day, you'd be on the phone, and we would talk about it. We could not be seen together. Now today, they're driving together. So you know, the mystique is gone, and I hate that. You know, my mom still thinks it's real. She goes, "Why did you let that son of a bitch?"
How the audience still thinks it's real?
My mother still thinks it's real. I never broke kayfabe with her. When I would come back all bleedy, and you know, she would see me the next day with, what? Who? Where? Didn't you press charges? And where's that guy at now? He went back to his country, and look, you can't even get him to go to be incarcerated for assault and battery. I said, perfect. It's perfect. There was a time that I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the Guerreros. Eddie Guerrero,
Yes.
Chavo Guerrero.
I used to photograph Lucha Libre years ago.
Well, I think it was Chavo Guerrero Sr. I wrestled him, and my mom loves him. So I said, hey, brother, you gonna get a picture? He goes, oh, no problem. So he comes out and he thinks, I'm gonna take a picture with him. No. Mom. So she's excited. Boom. I go, and who you rooting for tonight? She goes, I'm sorry, son, but I must stay neutral. I said, wow. Not even your own flesh and blood are you gonna root for me? I said, it's okay. Again, I know it's real. She still thinks it's real. It was funny, right after I wrestled him, I would
clean up. I wanna just
probably
clean up
4 months later he passed away.
Okay, everybody, I'm gonna clean up
How'd you get started in this?
and
Again, watching my
do the next
my
step.
cousin
So
wrestle.
thanks for watching.
Just
Bye,
watching
guys.
them. They didn't have a ring. They would be training